low performance might not be because that person doesn't know what they're doing. It might be because their attributes don't line up properly. There is significant kind of friction in one's life. They may, in fact, be in a position, in a role, in a job, in a niche that is not suited to their normal attribute profile. And they're having to consciously behave differently, consciously dial up or dial down their attributes so that they can actually conduct the job, which you can do. That's okay, but it doesn't feel as good. Your top 5 attributes are just as meaningful and have done just as much for your success as your bottom 5. In other words, you being low on your bottom 5 is also why you're successful.
That's Rich Diviney. He spent over 20 years in the U.S. military, where he revolutionized the selection, assessment, and training of some of the very most elite Navy SEALs. He later went on to write the best-selling book, The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance. And now he's working with Simon Sinek to launch a joint course about the secrets of high-performing teams. So you'll learn 1, the crucial difference between skills and attributes. 2, when your weaknesses are actually strengths. And 3, a neuroscience hack for focus and overcoming stress. And if you want to get a quick summary write-up of some of these takeaways, I recommend you sign up for the free Gold Nugget email newsletter at awesomeatyourjob.com. That's the Gold Nuggets at awesomeatyourjob.com. I'm Pete Bukaitis. This is How to Be Awesome at Your Job. And now, here's Rich. Rich, welcome.
Thank you, Pete. It's good to be here.
Well, I'm so excited to hear about some of your wisdom associated with the attributes. But I think I'm going to put you on the spot and ask that you kick us off with a thrilling, riveting tale related to your time in the Navy SEALs and or training that's also instructive and tease us up. So no pressure, but I want you to check every box with your opening story.
All right. Well, so I went into the Navy SEALs. I joined the teams in 1996. I graduated at Purdue University, was commissioned as an officer, went straight to training. And then got through training, which is always a good thing because, you know, it's about a 90% attrition rate at SEAL training, which is called BUDS, Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL training, right? And so I got through in 96. Beginning of the career was normal, but there was nothing going on. Of course, 9/11 happened and things got very busy and kinetic. But what happened between 2005, 2010 is I went to one of our very specialized SEAL commands, and that selection process was unique and intense. And I actually took over that selection process in 2010. And in doing so, really had to figure out what we were kind of looking for performance-wise. So in other words, so to get to this command, you had to have stellar performance reviews, you had to have recommendations, psychological exams, physical tests, all that stuff. And when you went through a 9-month course, a selection course, and 50% of the guys who went through didn't make it, right? So 50% of the top Navy SEALs did not make it through. And that's okay. Every selection course implies attrition. But I think what was not okay and what they asked me to do was that we weren't able to effectively describe or understand why guys weren't making it through. We'd say something like, well, the guy couldn't shoot very well. Okay, well, you tell a Navy SEAL of that caliber he can't shoot very well. That's like, I mean, this guy's probably shot more rounds than most people in the military. So it's disingenuous to him and disingenuous to us. And so they asked me, they said, Rich, we need you to look at performance and figure out what's going on. And so I had to really deconstruct performance. And the couple stories that I'll harken back to that hammered this home for me in terms of what I needed to look at were these. So in basic SEAL training in BUDS, you spend hundreds of hours running around with 300-pound with big boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles, running around with those things, freezing in the surf zone. I was doing this work in 2010, and I had already been on hundreds of combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I can tell you with certainty, never on one of them did I carry a big heavy boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole, right? So what I recognized in that moment was that they weren't training us in those moments to be Navy SEALs. They weren't training us in the skills of being SEALs. They were actually teasing out these qualities. They were putting us in these environments to tease out these qualities, to see if we had what it took to do the job. So then I kind of thought back, and I remembered a story I'd heard from an older instructor, and he said, Rich, years ago, a kid showed up to SEAL training, and he walked into the instructor's offices, and he said, I want to be a Navy SEAL. And the instructor said, okay, well, you have to do a swim test. And the kid said, fine. So they took him out to the pool, and it's an easy test, like 50 meters. So 25 meters to one end, 25 meters back to the other end. He gets all ready to go, and as soon as he jumps in the pool, he sinks right to the bottom of the pool. And at the bottom of the pool, he begins walking across the bottom of the pool to one end. He touches one end, he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other end. He comes up, he's gasping for air. The instructor looks at him and says, what the heck are you doing? And the kid who's still trying to catch his breath looks at the instructor and says, "I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim." And at that point, the instructor looks at him and pauses, and then he says, "That's okay, we can teach you how to swim." And the idea is, why did the instructor say that? The instructor said that because he knew if this kid had the attributes, the qualities to show up to Navy SEAL training, one of the most elite maritime units on the planet, and he didn't know how to swim, he had everything inside of him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be easy. So that was really the big story, the big aha for me in terms of bifurcating the terms between skills and attributes, and the fact that if we look at just skill, we're missing a huge percent of the performance picture, because we have to look at these qualities that people bring to the table if we want to understand performance at very elemental levels.
Okay, well, yes, let's dig in to some depth in a moment. The distinction between skills and attributes, I think that's really thought-provoking and useful. But first, I'm curious, with your specific charge, in terms of, we got to get to the bottom of why. Why are half of these super highly trained, experienced operators not getting through?
Yeah.
What was the answer?
Well, the answer was we were looking for some specific attributes, and the guys who weren't making through either they just didn't have enough of them. So, for example, a couple of the attributes I talk about in the book are the mental acuity attributes, which are situation awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability, right? When you are doing, for example, the level of operations that we're doing, in this case, close quarter combat, where you're going in and clearing rooms to rescue hostages, it's a very rapid, very fast, very dynamic environment inside of which you have to do live fire, you have to take instruction, you have to learn, you have to upload it, you have to be very cognizant of your buddies, you have to move quickly, you have to hit your targets. And I think what was happening, that most of the guys would drop out during that phase, and I think what we found was that they were, again, they didn't have none of these, and none of us have no attributes or zero attributes, but in this case, they didn't have enough of an ability to run into an environment, be situationally aware enough to pick a target, focus in on that target, address that target, and then switch to the next target rapidly. So it was I think that the attributes that we didn't see that were the most predominant in predicting failure, or at least attrition, were enough of those mental acuity attributes. And then another one would just be resilience. Resilience is defined as this ability to bounce back to baseline. It's not really getting back up when you get hit. It's the ability to bounce back to get back to baseline. So you think about that rubber band, you stretch, you let it go, it goes back to its original shape. Can you bounce back from hardship or even success? And the guys who would be screwing up and they'd get the spotlight on them and just get hammered, some guys would just be able to wash that off and bounce back. Other guys would just go into a spiral. And so that was, if we saw that was certainly an attribute that we needed to see predominance of, because we can't have folks who can't bounce back to baseline rapidly enough. So those were probably some of the most predominant ones. And then there were others that we kind of identified too, but less predominant.
And so I'm intrigued, Rich. We talk about attributes versus skill. Is this mental acuity stuff and the resilience bounce backing stuff not learnable, trainable, developable skill?
So it's developable. It's not teachable. Let me just identify the terms here just real quick for the audience. A skill is not inherent to our nature. In other words, none of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball. We're taught to do those things. We're trained to do those things. Skills direct our behavior and know in specific environments. Here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then skills are very visible. They're very easy to see, which means they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. You can put scores around them, statistics, and otherwise. You can put them on resumes, which is why we get seduced by skills often when we're picking teams or performance evaluating. But what skills don't tell us is how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. So this is when we lean on our attributes. So attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. In other words, all of us are born with levels of patience, situational awareness, adaptability. Now, you can develop them over time and experience, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children, right? So anybody who has small kids or has experienced small kids will agree with me when I say there are 1.5-year-olds who are patient and there are 1.5-year-olds who are impatient, right? So there's a nature-nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't direct our behavior. They inform our behavior. They tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. So my son's levels of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike and falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're difficult to see, they're very difficult to assess, measure, and test. But they come up the most viscerally during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty. So the idea is we all have all of the attributes. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. So if we take adaptability, for example, and 7 is high and 1 is low, I'd be a 6 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it, right? Someone else might be a level 3. So the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow and roll with it. There's friction there. They're still adaptable because all human beings are. It's harder. So if we're kind of line these up like dimmer switches, we'd all have different dimmer switch settings. So the idea is, yes, you can take an attribute you're low on and develop it, but you can't do it the same way as a skill because, and just one more thing for your audience, a way to distinguish between an attribute and a skill is to ask yourself a question: can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So Pete, you could say to me, Rich, I want to go to a range and learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye, right? I could take you to the range and teach you how to do that in a couple hours. All right, that's a skill. Or you could say, Rich, I want to learn how to be more patient. I can't teach you that. All right, that has to be self-developed. So to develop an attribute you're low on takes three things. The first thing is you have to know you're low on it. The second thing is you have to have a need, desire, or motivation to develop it. What do I mean by that? Well, we have to understand that just because you're low on an attribute does not mean you need to develop it. In fact, developing that attribute may be detrimental to what you're trying to do. I always say the stand-up comic with too much empathy is going to be a lousy stand-up comic, right?
I'm sorry, you didn't like that joke?
That's right. Yeah.
Boy, I feel terrible. Let's just call off the set.
Or I don't even tell the joke, right? I mean, so just because you're low doesn't mean in fact, your being low might be exactly why you're so good at what you do. But assuming both are true, you're low on it and you feel like developing will actually help your niche. The third is the most important. To develop an attribute, you must go find environments and place yourself in environments that tease and test that attribute. So if you want to develop your patience, you have to go find environments that test and tease and develop your patience, whatever that looks like for you. It could be, I'm going to drive in traffic. I'm going to deliberately drive in traffic, or I'm going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in. I always say have kids. That'll develop patience. But whatever that is, you can do that for any attribute. So those dimmer switches are not, and our attributes aren't immutable, but they certainly take more effort and consideration in terms of developing them or increasing them.
I hear you there in terms of, I think that the 2-hour shooting example was handy because it's not like, hey, there's just a few guidelines associated with, lining up the sights or your breathing or, whatever the fundamentals are there. I was like, okay, now I know those things and I'm going to do those things. And oh, wow. Because I think maybe one thing that's coming to mind is you'll see like a transformational result from 0 to just a few hours later, has been my experience with learning skills.
Like,
yes. Oh, I had no idea. It's like, oh, okay, well, now I kind of know the fundamental things. I'm just going to do those things. And now, the results are way better. Versus patience, yeah, you're right. It's not like, okay, in 2 hours, I'm going to teach you deep breathing and thinking about where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And now you're done. Your patience has been tripled in quality. I hear it doesn't tend to work nearly that quickly in practice.
Yeah, it does not work that, I guess, linearly. And we have to think about attributes. The reason why attributes are so important is because it defines who we are at our most raw. Our raw selves, when the what is hitting the fan, when the plan goes out the window, we're steeped in uncertainty and chaos. These attributes are what rise to the fore. All the rest of it goes away. I always kind of joke, and you and I talked before we hit record about personality tests. I think most of them are fun and great. The only thing about personality we have to consider is that when the what hits the fan, personality goes out the window. And we at our most raw are running on these attributes. And I think the gift I was given in SEAL training and my teammates were given is that we, from day one of SEAL training, started to understand who we are at our most raw and started to understand who each other were at our most raw. Because then we knew, okay, when everything's dropping in chaos and uncertainty, we know exactly who's going to show up. And we know when to lean on each other and when to support each other and all that stuff. That's the importance of this stuff.
That's cool. Okay. Well, so I took the assessment and it was impressive, 250 items, but it went by super quick. And I got a kick out of how I have taken a number of these as well, such as Strengths Finder and more. And the results sort of have some confluence.
Yes. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess while we're distinguishing, we got skills, we got attributes, we got personality. How about strengths? Where do we put that into this?
So I'm glad you asked, because when we talk about attributes, we don't talk about good or bad. What we talk about is your performance fingerprint, right? What's your unique performance picture? And the reason why we don't talk about strengths and weaknesses is because your top attributes, your top 5 attributes, are just as meaningful and have done just as much for your success as your bottom 5. In other words, you being low on your bottom 5 is also why you're successful. Now, when we look at it honestly, what we say is, let's do some honest introspection and ask ourselves, okay, these are my top 5, these are my bottom 5, or these are my order ranked, whatever. What are ways that this has served me? But what are also ways that this can maybe not serve me? Because that's when we have to start to understand some blind spots. So the attributes equation is not about strengths and weaknesses. It's about where you show up performance-wise and where you might want to either dial down or dial up certain attributes or even develop attributes if you so desire. But there's no judgment, which is powerful because it takes judgment out of the picture, which makes teams run faster and better.
And it's interesting. So there's 41 of them in the report. But as I read through the names, they all seem like good. I'd like more discipline, charisma, confidence, courage, empathy,
that's
adaptability.
Exactly right.
That sounds great. I'd love to have more of that.
Yeah.
But you're saying like, well, having a whole lot of something is not always beneficial in a certain context, nor is having a very low score on something detrimental in a given context.
That's right. Yeah. Any one of the attributes, we could make an argument for pros and cons for that attribute. And we could also make an argument where at extremes, we could certainly have detriment, but the idea is pros and cons are what you look at and you start to say, okay, this is how and why I perform the way I do.
Well, and it's funny, I'm thinking right now, so in my attributes, my highest, we've got creativity, cunning, innovativeness, open-mindedness, integrity. And it's funny because right now I'm going through a process of getting a mortgage. And it's, and from my perspective, it's just kind of like, okay, guys, so you can see I got credit, I got assets, I've got income. So we're good to go here, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But the answer is no. Like we have to comply with all of the things perfectly so that in the United States, the way it works, we're going to resell this to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who need to have their standards complied with to a T. And that's why there's a low cost of capital associated with this. So your creative ideas associated with how you might prove this or that is not what I want. I want you to go to your bank and ask them for this very specific document and then include that along with 12 other very specific documents.
Yeah.
And then we're good to go.
So it's funny you should say that. By the way, your results are great. I've never seen creativity, cunning, and innovativeness all in the top 5. All 3 of those are attributes that involve imagination, but they're different to an extent, right? And this is where we have to get precise with the languaging. And this is one of the things we find very powerful about the attributes content, because we're very precise with the etymology of each word, right? So creativity is the ability to create something into existence that otherwise didn't exist. This is the artist with the blank canvas, the writer with the blank sheet of paper, the sculptor with the lump of clay, right? Just you're able to create new ideas that didn't otherwise exist. Innovativeness, on the other hand, is the ability to take something currently in existence and use your imagination to iterate on it and make it better, okay? And then cunning is the ability to use imagination to problem solve in ways that are outside the box thinking. So you have a very powerful trio there of using imagination on all different fronts and facets. The other thing about this is you're also high on integrity, which means, cunning, people a lot of times view cunning as pejorative, but cunning is not pejorative. Cunning is just outside the box thinking. But I always say the way we use cunning can be pejorative. In other words, you can use cunning malevolently, that's Bernie Madoff, or you can use cunning benevolently, that's Oscar Schindler, right? The fact that you're high on integrity means you're going to use all this stuff in a benevolent way, which is pretty cool. And then, of course, your open-mindedness does not surprise me, because as someone with all 3 of those imaginative attributes on top, you're someone who is constantly taking in and open to new ideas, because it probably just informs your ability to use more imagination. So I think it's a fascinating top 5. What are your thoughts when you see the top 5?
It does ring true in terms of StrengthsFinder. I think ideation was my number 1. And I do find that when I am in settings, like teamwork settings, that's what lights me up the most, is that let's figure out the new, cool, creative way to do the thing.
Yeah.
And what is less exciting to me is, okay, well, now we know what that is. So just do that hundreds of times repeatedly for the next decade. It's like,
yeah.
Ooh, can someone else please execute that?
Right. By the way, so let's just talk about now your bottom 5. That is, what you just said there is also indicated by your bottom 5, because you're low on patience, which means you won't bang your head against the wall. And then persistence. Persistence is an interesting one. It's defined as a kind of a firm steadfastness in understanding there's a course of action and sticking to the same course of action over and over again because you know it'll work. So I always call this, I usually say it's the stonecutter approach. The stonecutter basically taps that rock in the same place 100 times and nothing happens, because he knows that after the 101st or 107th tap, it's going to break, right? That's persistence. You're someone who's constantly trying to ideate, which means you like new ideas. And you have little patience for sticking to the same course if it doesn't make sense or if it's boring. You will shift you will shift very rapidly. Where it could be a blind spot for you is you have to say to yourself, okay, well, there might be times where staying the course is in fact what needs to happen. And that might be where you have to lean on someone else in your team who's better at persistence, who can basically say, hey, Pete, we need you to just stay the course. Your high imagination may find you in a position where you're just constantly inundated with new ideas. And it's tough for you to take one and stick to one because you're just constantly having new ideas. So, and again, this is not that these things do happen. These are just blind spots that may happen based on the way these attributes line up.
It's really true. And if I am not seeing some level of results when I'm doing a thing in my own world, I feel like I need some pretty robust evidence that this course is ultimately correct. Because like I did the thing 3 times. I haven't seen any good results or effects flow from it yet. And so I've coaxed myself. And you says, well, Pete, take a look at these impressive results on the random control trial that lasted 6 weeks. So let's give it the 6 weeks first.
Yeah, give it some time. And again, these are stuff you can do. Again, it's not that you don't have these attributes. They're just prioritized in your behavior lower than the other ones, which means you have to do more. You have to have more deliberacy in when you have to dial them up. Like you said, you have to consciously make the effort to say, you know what? I just need to stick to this. It's a conscious thing. Whereas if you're just acting without thinking, you're likely going to shift. So,
okay. So, well, this is fun for me. I've got a big report. So what do people who don't have that? What do they do?
Well, so they could always take the assessment, but I think one of the things folks can do is they can begin to interrogate their performance. And the way we do that is we look back at our performance, especially during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty, and only because that's when these things are most visible and visceral, and start asking ourselves some honest questions about how we showed up, right? So if we went through a situation and we say to ourselves, well, as everything was changing around me, I was upset and it didn't feel good and I couldn't really flow. It was hard for me to flex and flow. That might indicate you're a little lower on adaptability. And that's okay. It just gives you an idea of where you stand on these. And you can start to think about these attributes in terms of how you've performed. You could think about how you perform in every day, all day, but especially during stress, challenge, and uncertainty. Experiential knowledge is the most powerful in this case. And I would even encourage those who do take the assessment to look at their results and then begin to think about times in their lives where these attributes have served them or have not served them, and start to say to themselves, okay, I can see now experientially how and why these show up the way they do.
Okay. And then I guess I'm curious if you find yourself in a context, maybe it's a job or role, project, where it kind of seems like the attributes you have are not a great matchup.
Yeah.
Maybe I am a super empathetic stand-up comic.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Well, I always say, I like to think of human beings as cars, right? Just like the movie. But, some of us are Jeeps, some of us are SUVs, some of us are Ferraris. And there's no judgment because the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do and the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do. But it behooves us to lift our hood and figure out what we're running with, because the friction in our lives that you're talking about might be because we've been a Jeep trying to run on a Ferrari track this whole time, or a Ferrari trying to run on a Jeep track. And so I think what folks can do, if there is significant kind of friction in one's life, they may in fact be in a position, in a role, in a job, in a niche that is not suited to their normal attribute profile. And what's happening there is they're going to the job and they're having to consciously behave differently, consciously dial up or dial down their attributes so that they can actually conduct the job, which you can do. That's okay. But it doesn't feel as good. So the idea would be, ask yourself, okay, what are my attribute sets? How does that performance picture look? And what might be some niches inside of which I could use this to excel? And then if you're a leader of people, you have to start looking at performance differently. In other words, low performance might not be because that person doesn't know what they're doing. It might be because their attributes don't line up properly. And that happened to me when I was commanding officer of a SEAL command. And I had a supply department. I had 4 people in this future look kind of innovative type cell, and then 4 people in the logistics kind of admin bookkeeping cell. And I had 1 sailor in the innovative cell that was not performing, bringing down morale. And I brought her in. I started talking to her, and within 10 minutes, I recognized her unique attribute set was a complete misfit for what I had her doing. Right, but it was perfect for this other thing. So all I did was shift her. I shifted her roles. Her performance skyrocketed. So it is about helping people get in the right seat on the bus as well.
So if you have 41 attributes, and if you don't have a report in front of you, is there a bite-sized, manageable way you think about these in a few categories so we can kind of map ourselves out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the attributes themselves I've broken into categories. Certainly in the book, there's 5 categories. The work we do now, we have 9. You can find those on the website. But those categories are like the grit category. So what attributes make up grit? Mental acuity, what are the attributes that describe how our brain processes the world? Drive, what are the attributes that make up the driven person? We have vision attributes, which have to do with creativity. We have service attributes, which have to do with, our ability to serve other people. Social intelligence attributes, leadership attributes, and team ability attributes. And so all those are grouped so that the attributes can clump kind of in a nice organized fashion. It's not to say that those attributes are strictly in those categories. I mean, one, even though courage is a grit attribute, one could make an argument for courage also being a leadership attribute, but it helps them bin and organize the attributes in a little bit different way. I would say, though, if someone does, in fact, take the assessment and understand their rankings, I would offer and recommend people to look at their top 5, bottom 5. This is one of the reasons why the assessment pulls those out. Because the top 5, bottom 5 start to really describe and help one understand some unique aspects of their performance. The middle attributes basically are those attributes that you tend to easily shift in the polarities, between the polarities. So in other words, and I just have to look at yours, but we take something like charisma. Charisma is something that you're someone who can at times be charismatic and at times you're not charismatic. You can kind of shift between those polarities versus when you start seeing where they've been top and bottom, those are the ones you're most often like or most often not like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, there are times when they say, Pete, I want you to be the master of ceremonies for this event. It's like, well, okay, let's put on the tuxedo and that's the big smile and away we go.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And then there are other times where it's like, that's fine. I don't need to be the center of attention. I'd be happy to arrange the items at the event as well, if that's what we need to do.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. You shift in the polarities, which is what the middle ones indicate, which is good. So they're all useful in terms of understanding.
And when you say this is how we are under stress when it all hits the fan, maybe we could zoom out a little bit and share, are there general best practices, no matter what your attributes are, that are ideal for when we find ourselves in these intense situations?
The answer is yes. In fact, you're throwing out a nice preview for my second book, which is coming out in a few months, called Masters of Uncertainty, where I give some tools and techniques for, in fact, what we can do in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. So there are ways we can actually use our brain and our physiology to step through stress, challenge, and uncertainty better. One of those ways is just the way we can actually interrogate an environment and manage our autonomic arousal. One of the biggest things that happens to us in stress, challenge, and uncertainty is we get autonomically aroused, i.e. our amygdala gets tickled and our arousal goes up. This happens to a degree that can eventually, if unchecked, reach what we call amygdala hijack or autonomic overload, where we're acting without thinking. That type of amygdala hijack is very handy when we are getting out of the way of a moving train. We don't have to think about what we're doing, right? We just want to move and act, right? Not as handy in most other everyday stress and anxiety because we want to put conscious thought into our decision-making process. What happens as our autonomic arousal goes up is our frontal lobe begins to take a backseat to our limbic. And when we reach the point of amygdala hijack or autonomic overload, the frontal lobe has now gone back and we're operating on our limbic without thinking, right? So the key in challenge, stress, and uncertainty is to keep that frontal lobe engaged. And one of the ways we can do that is to ask conscious questions about our environment constantly. So in other words, what can I focus on right now at this moment? Even something like, how am I feeling right now? This is why name it to tame it is a very, very useful emotional technique, because an emotional tool, because it's pushing your limbic back a little bit, bring your frontal lobe online. So I think the idea is, as long as we're managing our arousal by keeping our frontal lobe engaged, and we can do that with better questions, it's a way to step through our environments of uncertainty, challenge, and stress.
Could you walk us through an example of some naming it, taming it, great questions?
Yes. One of the best questions you can ask in an environment of stress, challenge, and uncertainty is, what can I control in this moment? And what's cool about the brain is designed to answer questions. It's constantly doing it. And so if we deliberately put a question into our frontal lobe, our brain will immediately begin to come up with answers. And so if you put that question into your frontal lobe, you're going to start to get answers that allow you to say, you know what? Okay, I'm going to focus on this. So here's a real world example. It's a SEAL training example, but it can be relatable. In SEAL training, like I said, you spend hundreds of hours running around with big, heavy boats on your head. And I remember it was the middle of the night. We've been running with these boats on our head for hours and hours, and it was miserable. And we were on the beach, and we were running we're running next to this sand berm. And I remember being miserable under the boat, and I said to myself, okay, you know what? I'm just going to focus until I get to the end of the sand berm. That's what I'm focused on. I'm just going to get to the end of the sand berm. What I did in that moment, unbeknownst to me, but I deconstructed later, was I immediately took control of an uncontrollable situation. I gave myself a focus point, and I basically said, okay, end of sand berm. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I gave myself a goal, once I hit that goal, my brain gave me a dopamine reward for that. It's inevitable. When we set goals and accomplish a goal, we're going to get a dopamine reward, which allows then for us to do it again and ask another question. And so we can actually start setting these horizons in any environment and asking better questions about our environment so we can step through.
That's a really cool one. And I find that that's true with regard to any number of unpleasant tasks. If I can break this down into, I've got one page and I've got it into a dozen pieces, and I've got my green is my pen color of completion.
Yeah.
I don't know why. It just is. Green means done.
Yeah.
Money. Victory.
Yeah.
Then, it feels good. It's like, okay, there's one piece. As opposed to if you didn't have the segmentation, it's just like, I just got one big mess that I'm dealing with. And I've also found that handy for exercise, even in indoor sterile environments. I don't know, like a Stairmaster or a treadmill or a bike or an elliptical. I find myself doing that just with numbers. Like, hey, it's a 30-minute workout. It's like, hey, we forget past 15. That means we got the majority is behind me. That's awesome. And so I'm just making it up. And yet it helps.
Well, and even that process. So neuroscientifically, this is what we call DPO, duration pathway outcome. Something that a good friend of mine, Andrew Huberman, who's has a popular podcast called the Huberman Lab, he and I put together a few years ago. But the brain is constantly looking for these three factors in our environment to define it. One is duration, how long is this going to take? Two is pathway, what's the route in or out? And then three is outcome, what happens at the end. And so in the absence of one or more of those three things, that's when we'll find ourselves in uncertainty, challenge, stress, anxiety. So what's happening there is we are literally creating our own DPOs, right? Whether it's you in the gym, me on the beaches of buds, we are creating a duration pathway outcome, and we're taking charge of this focus point, and we're creating something to focus on and then strive toward. I call this process moving horizons because these horizons are constantly shifting, and the distance or the size of each horizon has to be subjective to the individual and subjective to the intensity of the task. So in other words, a more intense task, it's probably going to be a shorter horizon. If I'm in SEAL training in the surf zone, just freezing my butt off, and they're keeping us there for hours, which happens, right? I remember saying to myself, okay, I'm just going to count 10 waves. That was, my horizon was short. There are other times where I remember saying, you know what, I'm going to just make it to the next meal. The horizon shifts. The key in terms of the dopamine reward system is that you have to pick a horizon that's meaningful for you. In other words, not too hard, so you run out of steam on the way, but not too easy, so when you accomplish it, you don't get a dopamine reward. That's highly subjective. And so as you do that in the gym, in life, on the beaches of buds, you're shifting those horizons constantly and asking yourself, okay, what's the next meaningful horizon subjective to your own experience?
That's handy. And I'm thinking about just daily work in which you have to focus, because it seems unlimited. It's like there's an unlimited pile of things that you could do. And then the day could be long.
Yeah.
So then what do you do with that? I actually have a timer that I use, set to an hour or whatever. And then I find that very helpful in terms of, okay, I'm just going to crank on this for an hour. And sometimes it's like, no, I'm tired. 45 minutes is all that's going to happen this time.
Yep.
And then it feels very satisfying. It's like, I did the thing. That hour is complete. And now I'm having a break and it's all good.
Yeah, you're creating your own horizons, and the timer's helping for that. What you're doing also is you're practicing compartmentalization, which is one of your bottom 5, but the fact that you use a timer means you're actively practicing it, which is a good tool to use because that's handy and it helps you kind of set those DPOs.
All right. Well, Rich, tell me anything else you want to make sure to mention before we hear about some of your favorite things.
No, I encourage people to just start exploring their attributes. If they want to visit us on the website, it's theattributes.com, and we're going to give your audience a discount code for the assessment as well. So.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Big thanks to Rich for sharing his wisdom with us. And big thanks to our sponsors. Check them out. One sponsor to check out is Jenny Kane Home. I am in love with my super cozy Jenny Kane cashmere hoodie, and dare say I believe it is the coziest item that I own, bar none. And Jenny Kane Home brings those same delightful touches to home decor. It has been called the ultimate destination for elevated home essentials. Their designs are so intentional, their quality so high, everything there looks custom, and yet it arrives in your home so much faster than custom pieces do. They've got amazing pillows, throws, glass candles, dinnerware, and a strong rewards program that you can join completely free. Ginny Kane Home has everything you need to transform your space into a luxurious sanctuary. And How to Be Awesome at Your Job listeners get 15% off your first order when you use the code AWESOME15 at checkout. That's 15% off your first order at JENNIKAYNE, JennyKane.com, promo code AWESOME15. Curate your dream home with Ginny Kane. Well, now could you share a favorite quote, something you find inspiring?
The one that pops to mind is one from Einstein, because they have so many good ones. I don't want to murder it here, but it goes something like, everybody's a genius, but if you try to teach a fish to climb a tree, it'll look like an idiot.
And a favorite study or experiment or bit of research?
Recently, I heard of some folks in the AI space who have been starting to deconstruct the language of animals. How about that? They started to understand the language of elephants, whales, and different animal species, which I think is utterly phenomenal.
Wow.
Yeah.
And a favorite book?
One of my favorite books is probably Sapiens by Harari. I go back to that quite a bit. That's a great one.
And a favorite tool, something you use to be awesome at your job?
I honestly try to put together and arrange habit or times, periods where I can just be in my own head, whether it be if I'm jogging in the woods or even on an airplane, I can look out the window. But times I can really just be in my own head and think about and process ideas. I think that's a gift that we should give ourselves. We should all give ourselves more.
Okay. And is there a particular nugget you share that people really resonate with and quote back to you often?
When it comes to leadership, the one I hear the most is that being in charge and being a leader are two separate things. Being in charge is a position, being a leader is a behavior. And the one I hear the most is I tell people, you don't get to self-designate. You don't get to call yourself a leader. That's like calling yourself good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you're someone they want to follow based on the way you behave. So if you want to be a leader, behave like one.
All right. And if folks want to learn more or get in touch, where would you point them?
Theattributes.com. So www.theattributes.com has everything there to, the book, the assessment, a bunch of stuff we do with companies and things like that. So yeah, feel free to go check it out.
And you have a final challenge or call to action for folks looking to be awesome at their jobs?
Yes. Growth is found outside of our comfort zone. So always make it a project to step outside the comfort zone often, because that's where you'll grow and that's where you'll learn. And it's a great place to be.
All right. Rich, this is so much fun. Thank you. I wish you all the luck.
Cool. Thank you, Pete. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciated Rich's perspective on how low attributes in certain contexts can be super helpful in terms of the empathy and the stand-up comic. And I'm thinking about empathy in terms of making difficult decisions, in terms of people. Sometimes I can have a hard time when I need to make a decision that I know is going to cause someone else to suffer, even when it's the right decision. I guess I'm a kind, empathetic person, which is sort of what I aspire to be. And yet, in certain situations, boy, it'd be more convenient and pleasant and comfortable if I had less empathy right now. Wah, wah. Great stuff from Rich. If you want to check out that attributes assessment, the discount code, thanks Rich, is AWESOME15 over at theattributes.com. And if you want to check out the show notes, transcript, and links to items that we've referenced here, including that link right there, it's at awesomeatyourjob.com/EP1006. Hope to catch you next time, and peace.